My name's Giles Fraser. I'm vicar in Elephant and Castle, parish in South London, and I write for Unheard.
And so, how long have you been in Elephant and Castle?
Oh, 7 years. So yeah, I like it very much. It's a fantastic place. I came from St Pauls Cathedral beforehand, which was grand and fancy, and I really like being at the Elephant and Castle. I have a very diverse congregation, probably just about black majority church. Majority of my parishioners are Ghanaian or Nigerian, that sort of thing. And high church, smells and bells, Anglican vicar, and I love it. That's what I do.
And is the area changing quite a lot at the moment?
Oh my word, is it changing? Daniel, you got my cup of coffee. That's what I really want.
Your eyes just
Thank
lit
you.
up like crazy.
I need coffee. Is it changing? It's changing enormously, and it's an area where people have come and gone for years. So there's lots of new communities that spring up all the time. I mean, it's not politics that provides community. It's sort of people. It's not a top-down thing. It's something that sort of it emerges organically from within the space in which people live, and it requires people to live in a particular space over time, over a certain period of time, have a sense of knowing their neighbours, knowing people around them, having their children live there. All of that sort of those things that knit people together. That's what's required. When you get rid of all of that through rapid social change, then everybody's reliant on the state, and the state isn't as good at the state's not as good at caring for you as your mum and dad are, or your neighbours are, or your churches, or those sorts of things. So I mean, the state obviously has a terribly important role. It does have an important role, I'd have a much bigger role for the state than the IEA would, but nonetheless, what you're missing when the community goes. You suddenly realise that actually all those things that you take for granted in terms of care are, when they're lost, you really notice them. So it's an interesting place. You have this sort of great diversity and energy, but also there's sort of pockets of loneliness and desperation. And I live literally on top of the Northern Line, and people go through. I can hear it, and I sit in church, and I can hear the Northern Line underneath the church. And thousands of people, millions of people go through the Elephant and Castle every day. But I also know those people who don't see anybody. For whom those sorts of it's just a sort of transitory movement, and nothing can. Those sorts of patterns of care are very weak. And that's a problem.
And do you see it as part of your role then to be a critic of the state, or is the church sort of an area which should be separate? It's sort of like it shouldn't be tarnished by the dirty politics of the state.
Church is always tarnished by dirty politics. I mean, I think the church is inescapably political. I think its message is inescapably political. But I personally don't think that there should be things like bishops in the House of Lords, or I don't think we should be allied with the state at an institutional level, and I think that actually blunts our radical message. Sometimes I think the Church of England is too easily conscripted by the establishment, and they can too easily become courtiers to the state. I felt a bit like that at St Paul's. I felt like I was a courtier, and I think the church sells itself too cheap when it does that, but definitely political.
And how did you feel like that at St Paul's? What were the who were pulling the puppet strings?
Well, no, it's not. It's never done. It's never done as directly as pulling the puppet strings. But there is that sort of dressing up and wandering around view of religion, which is ceremonial and state-focused. And in the end, it just becomes a little bit too natural, a bit too easy, and your sort of patterns of thought get shaped by being too close to the establishment, and it's too comfortable. And so that's the problem with the Church of England at its worst. I think is it's too comfortable. But the glory of the Church of England is its parishes, and the communities that it works in. It works in every community in the land, and that's a really important aspect of the Church of England's work.
I wonder if you could talk about the reasons you had to leave St Paul's, and if that has left you feeling, it doesn't sound like it, but feeling tarnished by the church or by the role of the church.
Well, I left St Paul's because we disagreed about how to address the issue of the Occupy movement that came 7 years ago, a long time ago, and my colleagues thought that. The dividing line between us is that my colleagues decided that eviction was the right thing to go for, including eviction with riot police, which is the end of what happened. And I thought that that should not be done in the name of the church. I was dead against that. I also thought, and this is maybe separate, I also thought that the Occupy movement raised really important matters of public concern, and they were doing it. I mean, the idea that people were starting to talk about economics in the pub, this was good. This was really, really good. And for all the sort of, there were those who criticised the Occupy movement, saying that their message was unclear or wasn't okay. But it was a space for conversation, and it definitely galvanised conversation, and it affected the church as well. I mean, I think I did a little sort of unscientific survey about the sermons on Christmas Day by bishops after the Occupy thing, which happened in October, and that almost all of them referenced economics in some way, in a way that they'd never done before. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, who was himself worked in business, I mean, he said to me that he didn't think he would have been Archbishop of Canterbury had it not been for the Occupy movement. So it had a serious effect on the church by camping outside St Paul's. Certainly had a serious effect on me.
And is it hard to? Do you have a strong sense of your own faith within the church that there is times when it separates?
I'm quite a party sort of church person, really. I mean, for all its faults, I love the Church of England, and I'm glad I'm within the Church of England. I mean, I really genuinely do, and I wouldn't be in it otherwise. But that's not to say that you don't fall out and have rows like you do with anybody that you love. And there's things about it that you wish were different. But I still think it plays such a... It articulates Christianity in a way that I share. It gets it right for me on so many levels, but I'm cheesed off with it. I was very cheesed off with it about Occupy. Yeah.
And do you think that so that was quite a reactionary situation in which Occupy were by St Paul's? But do you think the church could do more to support movements like this, but in an active way?
I mean, the thing is, when we talk about church and politics, the job of the church is to proclaim the gospel. Okay, it's religious. This is a religious organisation, and there are all sorts of ways in which social movements say things that the church will agree with. Extinction Rebellion may well be a case in point. So, but they're not the same thing, and they shouldn't ever be confused. And the job of the church isn't to be political per se. The job of the church is to proclaim the gospel, but the gospel is political. It just is inescapably so. And so, there's sort of there are points in which some of these new social movements are allied. You could are allied with the church in some ways, but they're not. They shouldn't ever be confused, and the church shouldn't over invest in social movements like that.
And moving on to you've done some work on Nietzsche and the pious side of Nietzsche.
Yeah, years ago.
I've
forgotten how to tell you, but go on.
Would you be able to explain how you can see Nietzsche in a pious way?
In a pious way?
Yeah.
Oh well, that is quite interesting. So Nietzsche came from a very long line of clergy. His dad was one. His grandfathers, and going back there was loads of them. His dad died when he was quite young, and he was brought up by his mum and sisters in a very sort of pious. Nietzsche won the university preaching prize. And then all of that ended. I mean, when he sort of became an atheist and a campaigning atheist, the really interesting thing about his atheism was that there was a sort of piety about it. There was a sort of the world depends on this. Almost your salvation depends on this. I mean, obviously in a secular way, but the question of God became a question of sort of real importance to him. And in fact, for me, that was one of the things that was really instrumental in my conversion to Christianity. So I went to university, a fairly straightforward atheist, and Nietzsche and others, Kierkegaard and a few others, but they raised the question of God in such a way that I thought I had to give it an answer. It was suddenly, I suddenly realised why the question was important. Whereas before, I didn't even think the question was important, that sort of atheist. That's the real atheism, by the way. Indifference is that's the real atheism. The Dawkins type of atheism, that's fine. That's a tiny flip away from Christianity. But indifference, that's the thing that Christians should be most afraid of. And Nietzsche was absolutely not indifferent. He raised the question of God in such a way that I knew something really serious depended upon how I answered it. So that was the beginnings of my sort of struggle with Christianity. And for years, people used to say about me, "Oh, Giles has got this weird hobby." Giles has got this weird hobby. He's like, he's interested in religion, and he reads all that stuff on the side. And I did, and it was for a long time it was a sort of quite an academic. Not that Nietzsche is a sort of academic-y writer per se. He's too passionate for that, but. For a while it was that for me, and then somehow I realised that I wasn't on the outside looking in, but I was on the inside looking out, and it had shaped my world. And I knew that that's what I had to do, and I still feel the same way about it as I did when I guess conversion is the word.
And what was it about those thinkers that made you realise the importance of it? Was it like their passion or the more arguments?
More passion is an aspect of it, but it was also a way of seeing the world, and whereas before I'd have looked at the world and the question of God was not raised by the world that I looked at. After reading all of that sort of stuff, I'd look at the sort of this beautiful scene, and I would go, there's something about this which is asking me a question which I'd never before. And funnily enough, it's the persistence of the question that in the end makes you see the world differently. It's not, very, very few people are argued into faith. And in fact, that's why, much to atheists' frustration, that's why people can't be argued out of it either. You don't get argued out of something you never were argued into, So it's more like falling in love, And you can fall out of love, so there is a process, but it isn't quite so susceptible to rational argument as many atheists presume. So they're quite frustrated. They think they've won the argument, but why has nothing happened with the person they think they won the argument with? And that's sort of because they're missing what it is that's charging the Christian vision.
And is that not also, you said that new atheism is not indifference, but aren't they also tackling with looking at the world and
Yes. No, I mean, new atheism is a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, I have all sorts of problems with it, but in one way, much more like Christianity than either side would feel comfortable with, actually. That, as I said, indifference is the thing that is the real killer. But I mean, lots of new atheists passionately engage with the sort of beauty of the world, with the nature of justice, with the nature of what is right, with the nature of the meaning of life, the universe, and everything, and all that sort of stuff. To my taste, in argumentative terms, it's more flat-footed than it used to be. I mean, I think, Nietzsche hated Christianity. He didn't just think it was wrong. He thought it was wicked, and that there was a sort of something that, and he also realised, Nietzsche did, and I think that new atheists don't get this. Nietzsche realised that the most important question is not the question about whether God exists. The most important question is sort of the question of personal salvation. It's like, how do I fit into this sort of like, and how is this broken person somehow, well, the language is saved, Now the idea that religion begins with the question of salvation, something that Luther, for instance, would be terribly important to, and Nietzsche was a sort of Lutheran minister. So Nietzsche asked the question of salvation and answered it by, you're saved by being an atheist. Okay, that's sort of it. The new atheist's not interested in that question. They really only want to know whether there is a thing up there called God or is there not a thing up there called God. And they think that's the nature of the argument. And I'm less interested in that question than people think I should be, actually. That's not the thing that keeps me awake at night.
And why is there so much indifference nowadays then? And how would you see that you can sort of tackle that indifference?
Well, I suspect that there is some connection between indifference and individualism. I suspect that the sort of cultural patterns in which Christianity were conducive to Christianity were within a sort of thick sense of community, as I talked about before. And that tends to be the case, that religion and community are, in Islam, in Judaism, religion works with, I think as we have become more individuated as a society, I think that religion finds us less to grab onto. And I think that's also true despite the fact that Protestantism was one of the reasons that individuated us. So the sort of idea that it's all about your individual commitment to God rather than your corporate membership of the church. That is a part of the historical process by which the rise of the individual, that and capitalism and a number of other things. But I think probably that's the connection, something between faith and community. Communities, faith for me is a corporate experience. It's something about the priority of the we over the priority of the I, and it's embedded in that sense of we. There's a story I've told a couple of times, is when I had to do a terrible funeral when I was quite young as a priest, and I sort of lost my faith. It was a child, it was a funeral of a child, and I was a vicar in the Black Country in the West Midlands, and a big, cold, empty church. It was a horrible experience. And for days afterwards, I thought, this is all rubbish. I just come out of university, I was sort of fresh with ideas. But the reality of it, I thought this was rubbish. But I'm the vicar, so I have to go to church on Sunday morning, and my job is I can't say, I'm not getting up this morning, I don't believe in it. And I stand there and you say the creed, and I suddenly realised the beginnings of the creed is, we believe in God the Father Almighty, correct? We. And I thought, actually, I'm a part of this group of people. I want to be I'm in this group of people, and at the moment you're doing the believing for me. And I'm rather grateful of that. And that lasted a number of months, but it gave me a much greater sense that somehow your faith is sustained by other people. You're carried by other people, even intellectually, even when you can't add it up, make sense of it. So no, I do have a very strong corporate sense of the church and the need for the church.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.